welcome back. This week we are watching the Olympics on TV and pulling out some stash to completely experiment with a drops hat pattern that I thought had an interesting look. And I've never made a hat before, and I'm following the pattern exactly as I experiment, again with some stash yarn. But I quickly realized that this experiment is not going to look anything like the pattern picture because I have some serious dome action happening. Now, I did check the gauge and I'm using the hook, and so again, I'm thinking I didn't have too many increases or I would have had a wavy kind of action happening. So I'm suspecting that either my gauge, my stitch is too tight or I need more increases in here. But I'm curious, so I just keep going, following the pattern just to see what happens. And the first attempt isn't as horrendous as I was thinking. It's giving me some interesting ideas. Again, a look at back loop only versus front loop only on a slip stitch. And I know there are some interesting things you can do with brims as well. And I did want something that is going to be longer than any hat I currently own to cover my ears. So I'm thinking not a horrendous first attempt at a hat, but let's frog it out and see what else happens. So let's play around with, again, trying a magic circle just to see how that happens. And as I keep going up in hook size, I finally, at a 10 hook, get a slip stitch that isn't doming and kind of giving me a flatter look. So I'm experimenting, but with a 10 hook, of course, my gauge is way off now. And this hat is ginormous as I just kind of keep trying to follow the pattern and see what happens with the flatter top. So as I go back and look at the original pattern, I do realize that it says a medium large is for a 22-inch head, but even the original attempt was much larger than I needed. So I'm kind of now making notes of what is my gauge with the slip stitch and a 10 hook, and let's just start freehanding to see what happens and kind of get the shape that I really am interested in. So I thought this might help kind of illustrate, because it can be kind of hard to see how the hat is before blocking. And this is just, again, a traditional bucket hat that I had that is sort of the overall kind of more squared off shape I was looking for. And that bucket hat measures 6 inches across the top. And so I was experimenting different times here. Again, yes, weird, kind of still magic circle issues happening with 8.5 inches across the top, or the bucket hat was again 6 inches. So let's try 6.5. And again, seeing what happens as I try and look for much more, I guess, of a traditional cloche or bucket hat squared off look. So without sort of, again, a pattern to follow, I'm doing 6.5 inches and then do increase as I go down the sides now to kind of get that bucket shape. And because I'm frogging it out and I'm really too lazy watching TV to actually untie all the knots, you're going to see as we go forward some really sketchy results with colors because, again, I couldn't be bothered untying everything. But when I think about, again, those clean transitions on the first attempt, it is very interesting that as you do that switch between sort of front loop only to back loop only to get the sort of rib effect, at the start of it, you get a really nice, clean color transition. And so that was giving me some ideas for what I would actually want to do with a final hat and the kind of yarns that I'm interested in actually experimenting with as I figure out the shape. So very clean transition as you start, and a different transition as, again, you finish off back to front loop only and end up, as this pattern was doing 3 rows of back loop only, to end up with sort of a 2 row rib kind of effect. But again, increasing to get that sort of bucket hat as I went down the sides. And again, I'm a 22-inch head, so just again to give you some context, this bowl when I measure is 23 inches. So again, that flared out brim, would be around 23 inches if I'm using the bowl, just to kind of illustrate how the hat could be blocked. So I thought, interesting, again, maybe I like a bigger circle at the top and a less flared out effect, or do you like the sort of 6 inch and 6.5 inch top with, again, much more of a flare out now on the sides as I go down and do those increases. And of course, I'm also thinking about the placement, not really liking exactly where some of this sort of embellishment with the back loop only kind of ends up on the actual hats. So again, really helpful as I play around with the stash yarn and experiment just simply on shape. So yes, it's looking very sketchy as I didn't frog this out and transition colors nicely. But again, I'm only really wanting to get a sense of shape and how the yarn works, and whether, again, I like this more squared off bucket hat look versus more of a peaked kind of dome hat. And again, lots of different ways that you could do a straighter brim that's longer, or again, do a different kind of brim as you think about all the different options that I could have around shape. So the end result on the squared off one wasn't quite as squared off, I think, as I originally thought of. And again, if I kind of don't pay attention to the horrible colors, it wasn't actually a horrible hat either. I thought it fit nicely and would give you some interesting brim shapes. So for people that have way more experience with hats, because this was my very first attempt, I'd love it if you give me a thumbs up if your preference really is for that more bucket hat shape. And again, I think I ended up with a favorite sort of on my side of a less kind of curved out look, a much more straighter look like a cloche. And again, I'm playing still around with some of the trim options. Or give me a thumbs down if you really do recommend a much more peaked dome shape, if that's going to be much more practical. Again, that shape can even have lots of different brim options. So I would just love to hear, again, a vote thumbs up for square or a vote thumbs down for dome peak. Really helps me as I now think about, again, shapes and options, and starting to look for some yarn that I think would make a next version experiment interesting as well. So as always, we appreciate your votes and your comments. If you have any experience on hats, you can share, and we look forward to reading all of those as we continue and update you on where this experiment goes next.